And joining me now is Jassa Ahluwalia, author of the memoir, Both, Not Half. Jassa, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Tell me briefly the importance of how important it is to remember where we come from. You are half British, half Punjabi, Indian, if for those that aren't familiar with Punjab, but you embrace both identities. How important is it to remember where we come from?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would no longer identify as half. That's essentially the nature of the title. Very much feel both. I think this is figuring out, I think it's not just where we come from, it's figuring out who we are. And I think figuring out and answering that question, who am I, is really, I think it's the purpose of all of our lives, really. I think it informs everything that we do. So yeah, it feels quite fundamental.
And based on your experience, tell us about briefly, tell us about that journey of balancing where you're, with respect to where you're from and what it took for you before you started kind of feeling comfortable in your own skin.
Yeah, so the thing is, when I started writing this book, because of all the books that I've read on race and all the conversations I've heard on race, it always seems to be grounded or originates from a point of trauma, a sense of feeling othered very early on in life. And for a while, I felt like, did I even have a valid story to tell? Because that wasn't my experience. So for me, I had this beautiful, both whole, multiple upbringing, this childhood where I was this little white Punjabi, and it wasn't in any way remarkable, and that was for a number of reasons. My parents made a real conscious effort to raise me fully immersed in both my cultures. My white English mum learnt Punjabi well enough to keep me in line, like "Chup kar, baith ja, hat ja," be quiet, sit down, stop that.
Don't
And
touch that, sit
yeah,
down.
we would use like bits of Punjabi around the house, put the dud back in the fridge, for milk and stuff like that. So,
Yeah.
and then my Punjabi grandfather, my turban wearing Punjabi grandfather, was a teacher in my primary school. So like my identity was never really questioned when I was, in those formative years of my primary education. And then I was also growing up in Leicester, which is this incredibly mixed heritage city. The city shuts down for Diwali. It was only in my adult life that I realized that that was actually remarkable, and that Leicester's Diwali celebrations are some of the biggest outside of India. So I went through. There was no sense of having to balance because I was whole and full, and yeah, I didn't really have any challenges in that way. And then when I sort of hit my early 20s, and I'm interacting with the binaries and the categories that organize the adult world, and also in my work as an actor, where very much my appearance dictates the kind of work I get to do. I suddenly felt like I didn't have this, I didn't have access to this huge part of who I am, and I felt like I was being presented with a choice, that I had to make this choice between am I this or am I that, and I couldn't figure out how to reconcile that, having, and initially I was like wanting to sort of escape back in this sort of nostalgic way, pining for my lost childhood. But then really around 2015, this is when this sort of started happening. Then the journey to articulating Both Not Half was really realizing that it was entirely possible to forge a new future in which I could be both and whole, and I could return to that childlike state of ease, but it would have to come from conscious effort and work, as opposed to the sort of the naive ease of childhood.
I empathize with that. There's a couple of quotes that I really liked. But before I get into that, let me just ask one of these quotes and then I'll get back to this one. This one was one of my favorites. A lot of quotes that you use were one of my favorites, so I can't really pick a favorite. But this one, going back to talking about being an actor, my Indian ancestry was my personal life, semicolon, I was professionally white. Could you explain that?
Yeah. Well, so I'd sort of, the industry conditioned me to be grateful for my whiteness, because my whiteness was how I got work. I was able to audition for, like a Victorian Cockney telegraph boy in Ripper Street, which was like a big moment, sort of step up in my career at that point. I played like a Nantucket whaler, and The Whale for BBC One. Those were the kind of opportunities that were coming my way, and it felt like to reveal or be or celebrate or push my Punjabi identity would make those opportunities go away, and really like that wasn't totally that was grounded in reality. My brown peers, very talented actors who were struggling to get their foot on the ladder at that time, and so I was like, well, there seems to be more work. Objectively, that's true. There was more work for white actors, and therefore, presenting myself as a white performer. And he wasn't even really a conscious choice. It's just that that's what my headshot was. And then the casting database at the time, and I've done work since in the industry in the UK to change the casting practices around mixed heritage performers. But at the time was very much focused on appearance. And so, my number one appearance on my CV, on my resume was white. And mixed race was used very much as a sort of a second, like a shorthand for like light-skinned black, like a black and white mix. And so, even though I had that on my CV, I sort of knew that that was not what people meant.
Right.
And I think that's sort of where that feeling of being professionally white came from, because I was really worried. I felt that even I went for an audition not long after I did Ripper Street, for example, and I play a sort of, yeah, like a working class Victorian Cockney in that. And a casting director around that time said that she hadn't realized that that wasn't, my actual accent, or that I wasn't from East London. And that had sort of influenced her decision to get me into the room. So it's like even me playing a different class background was sort of having an impact on people's perceptions of me just as a white actor. So let alone I felt very nervous about yeah, bringing my full Punjabiness into the picture as well.
Well, and we should clarify. This isn't, kind of like a dig on you. This is just because you never tried to hide your Punjabi ancestry. This was just kind of like a means of getting work. Like you were never ashamed of it.
No,
And
no, yeah, I never, it was never like, I never actively concealed it. I used my name. I was very
yeah,
proud of my name. If people asked about it, it came up. But, I also say in the book, Jassa Ahluwalia, with that name, even though it's a very specifically Sikh Punjabi name,
hmm
that name associated with this face resulted in, there was a sort of an ambiguity around
yeah.
it, which I was able to, yeah,
And
trade on.
and there was two quotes that kind of lead into that. One of them was when you had to go to the ER because your appendix was about to burst. So the doctor was looking for you, but didn't register that your
Yeah.
name would fit someone who looks like you. And you had this quote, it felt like an accusation, as if somehow I'd been hiding from them. We were looking for an Indian, and I didn't have the energy to explain my backstory. The pain in my gut was back with a vengeance. And then we're talking about you being in the entertainment industry, and then there were famous. This is going to sound very esoteric for other people, but for you and me, we know these names: Riz Ahmed, Guz Khan. um, you saw these folks, and then you said, in every outrageous caricature and scenario, I recognized my family and myself. It felt like they were granting me permission to belong.
Yeah.
And just talk to me about the importance of representation in the entertainment industry. Seeing people that may not necessarily look like you, but they know they know what it's like.
Yeah, that was what really struck me, particularly about yeah, particularly with Just Rain's content, actually, the Desi Parents and sketches that he did. Because I'd grown up, and this was also part of why I had this sort of strange no problems during my upbringing, is that I grew up during the 90s, and there was this real multicultural boom. There was like a real like golden age of like South Asian creativity during the
Yeah.
90s in the UK. So stuff like Goodness Gracious Me was on the TV. You had like Bali Sagoo, you had like Punjabi MC, like it felt like it was everywhere, and just
And I think it's fair to say, we shouldn't call them Bollywood films, but for the American audience, Bollywood films, Indian cinema was at its golden age. So
Yeah. I was like, yeah, dancing to like the soundtrack to Mora, like must like as a kid.
yeah,
Yeah. So, sorry, I just lost my train of thought there. Where was I going?
perhaps I did that. We were
Um,
talking about the representation, entertainment
Oh
industry.
yeah, the representation. So yeah, but there was nothing that felt contemporary. That felt like, goodness gracious me was sort of more of my parents' generation. And even though, I mean, it's still hilarious, it's great comedy, but the Desi Parents and stuff suddenly felt like this was my generation. And it was also it was the diaspora experience as well. It was like
Yeah,
Canada. There was so I felt connected, and I think that was the thing. I was craving belonging and connection beyond my immediate family and without looking to like elders, and so to have people who were like around my age talking about similar things suddenly felt incredible. And I think that's that sense of permission. I was like, I'd love to do something like that. I'd love to be drawing on my heritage, my history, my experiences of growing up in a Desi household. Because I spent a large part of my childhood growing up with my Punjabi grandparents. So in a way, I had this sort of like cross generational experience as well. And I saw that so much in those videos, and I was like, yeah, that it was is really, really. I think until I'd seen it, I didn't realize how much I was missing it, and then how much
yeah.
that was really what then inspired me to do my first video online speaking Punjabi, which sort of precipitated the whole both not half movement.
Yeah, going back to the age thing, you and I are very similar in a way because we're both millennial South Asian men who, for lack of a better word, have faced identity challenges. Why does it feel like, especially in the South Asian community, though, where we have to choose how we identify?
Um, I guess because we've been presented with it as a choice. I think
Hmm.
that's something that we've just sort of inherited. And I think this comes from all sides. The idea that I think it's particularly relates also to diaspora communities as well, where there's a sense of the need to preserve and the need to hold on, and it sort of stifles evolution and change and growth. And I think the biggest thing that I've discovered through my writing and through the whole Both Not Half journey is that identity in all forms is constantly in flux. It is a constant evolution. Um, and so I think that that's really the reason. I remember like my Punjabi granddad going to thinking that he was going to really impress his brothers in India with his mobile phone when we went on a trip in, I think it was like 2006 or something. Um, and then they all had their own mobile phones, and they were all actually flip phones with color screens, and his was still a sort of a black and white brick. And it's like in his mind, he'd sort of forgotten that like technology had also progressed in India. There was like, this progression happens,
Yeah.
um, and so yeah, and I think partly also, it's not just that sense of preservation, but I think it's also particularly when it comes to the idea of being multiple things, we
Hmm.
live with this legacy of racism, of scientific, quote unquote scientific racism, this hierarchical mindset, um, which is why we have phrases like "I'm half this, I'm half that," or even if you're not necessarily of mixed ethnicity, I feel half this, I feel half that, because that very racist mindset of like you can only be fractions, you have to be fractions in order to make that
Right.
whole is a sort of a way of thinking that we've inherited. Whereas actually, if you just reject that premise, that I reject the idea that I am fractured and fractional, and actually I am can entirely be whole and multiple, and actually by being my full and whole self, I am engaging in the process of making and remaking identity always. I think that's it's really empowering. A thing that really blew my mind was discovering that Guru Nanak Dev Ji never ate aloo gobi because potatoes and cauliflower were introduced to India by colonial powers. So Guru Nanak would have never eaten aloo gobi, which is obviously a quintessentially Punjabi dish. But it's I think that for me really underlined and highlighted how identity is something that you know changes over time.
I hate to bring this up because UK has its own political issues. Uh, th Whenever I present this question, I don't want us to talk so much about the politics. I want to focus solely on the words that were said. Former President of the United States, Donald Trump, when he was speaking about Kamala Harris a couple of weeks ago, he said she was always of Indian heritage and she was only promoting Indian heritage. I didn't know she was black until a number of years ago when she happened to turn black, and now she wants to be known as black. So I don't know, is she Indian or is she black? I wanted to get your thoughts on this, especially based on what you just said about
Yeah.
maintaining that, getting rid of those hegemonic identities of half and half.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think we're all very familiar with Trump saying stupid, idiotic, and racist things at this point, so that doesn't come as a huge shock. I think what's interesting, if that's the right word, is that clearly we've got somebody here using ideas of racial purity essentially to undermine his opponent, and I think that's really interesting because essentially like a lot of the politics of the right, the populist politics is based around ideas of divide and rule, us and them, and that requires you to believe in separations of people. And then you have somebody who's got a mixed heritage who by their very existence sort of reveals that to be a fallacy. And it's, I think it really then undermines the power of a populist when they can't easily box you in, being like, are you this or are you that? And I think I found that just, it was so revealing that that was what Trump reached for as a way of trying to undermine Kamala Harris was, yeah, I think just really sort of revealed the weaknesses of yeah, of how the weaknesses that of how populism operates, essentially.
I get that. And I'm not sure. I think we talked a little bit about this, off camera. You've never really been to Texas. You weren't really familiar with the diversity in Houston, where I'm from. Houston prides itself on its diversity, but there's still those conversations about, racial hygiene, like and division. Even to this day, it's 2024, but we're still having those conversations of what are you, where are you really from, that sort of thing. What will it take for us to overcome this need to place one another in these socially constructed boxes or asterisks? For example, you're Punjabi, but you look dot dot dot, or you're black, but you're also Muslim, kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. I find the idea that some people find like Islam and blackness as a strange combination absolutely bizarre. It's like it's a
No,
special
I
kind
know, I know. No,
of.
and this is something that I'm not ashamed to say, but I do pray with African American Muslims, with Black Muslims, because that's the community that I really just gravitate towards. They've always been so welcoming and just their belief. So it does always get that. Wait, so did you convert in the prison system, or no? I was actually born
Right.
Muslim.
Right. Isn't it?
Yeah, not that there's anything wrong with converting to the prison system, but it's like, no, that's a shameful stereotype, and
Yeah, yeah. It's like I'm trying to not be racist, but also being racist.
yeah,
Like,
yeah, right.
um, yeah. What will it take? I guess well, it's a very difficult question to answer. I don't think I can give an absolute answer, but I would suggest that perhaps the realization that this is something that is about all of us. I think there is often, a well-meaning liberal mindset which thinks that issues of origin and diversity and identity sort of don't apply to you if you are quote unquote the default in whatever way you interpret that. But I think what I've really realized with the both not half journey and the conversations I've been having, and what I really make explicitly clear is that none of us are half anything. All of us are both something, and I think the more we can all appreciate and understand the multiplicity um, that is present in all people, and see that as a means of connection, something that we can sort of rally around, without the need, without this sort of feeling that we somehow need to have divisions in order to have control and order. Like this is, I think that's really maybe where hope lies. I think I talked towards the end of the book about really discovering both not half really being an articulation of a non-dual mindset, the philosophy of non-duality, which is essentially the recognition that there is that separation as we see it is the multitude of things that we see in the world and through our senses is really just an illusion, but behind it all there is an ultimate oneness, and it is all entirely integrated and connected. And you don't necessarily have to have a non a sort of a connection to non-duality or a sort of spiritual mindset. Even if you just think of everything being, even if you are a materialist and you're like, well, everything's molecules, everything's just tiny little particles and energy, there is a fundamental oneness to the universe. And I think that's something that, starting the journey of both not half, sort of led me to that understanding. And I find it absolutely joyous now when I'm meeting people at signings, at events, at talks, and the phrase I love to hear is from people who've come to the event and they're like, I didn't think this applied to me, but actually, and I know it's not the same, but I sort of feel the same way as well about, and then they explain some aspect of their identity, and it could be, one parent came from a different class background, or perhaps, ethnically the same, but they're from a slightly different region, or one parent's from France, or it's just, there's like
Yeah.
different ways in which people feel multiple, and I think, yeah, just holding space for that to be like, this is something universal, I think that's where I'm coming from, and that's why this idea, and why the second half of the book gets into ideas of national identity, the politics of class and unionization, issues of gender and sexuality, because actually this is sort of, it's inspired a radical empathy in me, and
Mhm.
and I feel like that sort of, yeah, radical empathy is what we need.
I totally empathize with that. And I'm glad to hear you say that you embrace the connection that people are making. Because that's I found you before I read the book, and it was with the TED talk that you gave. And just this connection that we both have with our names. Now
Mm,
that I've read your book, and the part that I was most focused on, and this is before I read your book,
mm,
um, the importance of names. Your full, I guess, name is Jassa Ahluwalia. But before that, it took me by surprise to know that your name was Jasvinder.
yes.
And this was inspired by an 18th century Sikh commander. Likewise, my name, Ahmed Humble. Humble, Humble is also a city in Houston. It's also an adjective, but it was actually supposed to be Ahmed Hanbal. Hanbal, the name of the Islamic theologian, but I guess it's my own little Ellis Island story. The
Right.
doctors in Houston didn't know what she was saying, so they were just like, yeah, whatever. What was it like for you to legally change your name, getting that agency back?
Yeah. So just to clarify, the my name has always been Jassa Singh Ahluwalia, and Jassa Singh
Mhm,
Ahluwalia is the name of the Sikh military commander from the
mhm.
700s. Jasvinder was this name, this legal name that happened to get onto my birth certificate because my grandfather, you know, even though Jassa Singh Ahluwalia is very, very Sikh, very, very Punjabi, it's not a Vinder, Jeet, Preet, or whatever. So he was like, no, it needs to be
No,
a Vinder.
Singh is pretty up there. I'm Sharma,
Yeah,
so
right. So yeah, Jasvinder got onto the birth certificate, and yeah, it was sort of staking. And I did actually speak to my grandparents before I did that, because I was like, I don't know, maybe it is really important to them, but let me just check with them. They were still alive at the time, and they played it really cool. They were like, oh, it's not a big deal, and like my mum was like, it was a massive deal at the time. Um, but yeah, so for me, it was a beautiful moment, because it was, in a way, it was like, it was a um it was just it was something that I was able, it was an action. And I think
Hmm.
it sort of, it was like a line in the sand. It was like, for henceforth I know I am actively on this journey now. I am trying to assert my identity in the world. And that was a wonderful, wonderful feeling. And also to, to sort of close that loop a bit, that's the name that my parents wanted me to have. It was just because my mum was exhausted from having just given birth that the documents all got signed with that, with Jasvinder on it. So it was nice to be able to do that. Um, and yeah, I think, yeah, more than anything, it was just that, the act of asserting oneself and being like, this is who I am, this is who I am now going to be, and this is the journey that I'm on. And I talk about it in the book as well. When I talk about that change, is like, there was an aspect of the fact that Jassa as a name is quite ambiguous if you don't know the history. It doesn't jump out as a Indian or Punjabi name, necessarily, if you're not familiar with it already. And there was a bit of me that sort of enjoyed that as well, that there was a kind of ambiguity. And I think at the time when I did the name change, I was very much embracing this idea of ambiguity, and actually, you know, I was searching for very definite answers. And at that point, I was like, oh, maybe actually this uncertainty, this way in which I become a different Jassa in different scenarios, is actually maybe part of the solution. And so it was an embrace of that ambiguity as well.
Yeah, because, post 9/11, I will always try to hide my first name, Ahmed. I always try to hide that just because, and so try to embrace that ambiguity. Nobody's asking questions. I don't have to explain anything. It is what it is. Unfortunately, I still look like me.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah, yeah. And this is a big part of, like, particularly, in the context of the the sort of the racist riots that have been happening, or that were happening. They seem to have come to an end now, thankfully, in the UK. Is this is part of my experience, is this feeling of like, this is about me, and yet I don't have my darker skinned sister last week was sending lots of messages, feeling quite, nervous about leaving the house, about, if she was alone. She's exposed to a kind of a direct,
mhm.
she would be attacked in a way that, I probably would eventually, because I would be on that side of the fight, but like, I'm not first in line there. And that's, again, part of the, why I've done this book, why I'm doing this work, is because of, I there is an element of guilt in there as well. I feel like I somehow, I said it in actually this spoken word response piece I did to Riz Ahmed's The Long Goodbye, was, I think the line was, this white armor that I walk in keeps me safe and I feel guilt, and it's only when I'm talking in my father's tongue that I feel felt.
Mm.
And so there's that comment of being like, okay, yeah, this is who I am. I feel that racial tension. I feel like that violence is directed at me, but also I know that I'm not at as much risk, strangely.
Right.
It's a weird thing. And I'm just very keen to, particularly because you brought it up, is that, yeah, I'm acutely aware that I do not experience racism in the same way as, say, you do.
Mm.
Um, but at the same time, I do experience it, and it's
No, but
holding that.
that awareness is what keeps you grounded. And, you know, that comment you just mentioned about you speaking in your father's tongue. I loved this quote that you included very early on in your book. If you're reading this and feel guilty for not being able to speak whatever language you grew up with, recognize that it was never your responsibility and forgive yourself. It's also never too late to learn. I was very lucky to learn Urdu. Not even from my aunt or from my mom's family. I learned it from, and this is, you're probably going to call me a liar, but go ahead if you want to. We have some Chinese relatives that emigrated to Pakistan and they were living in California. They couldn't speak any English, so I learned Urdu from Chinese relatives.
I love that. That is such a brilliant story.
Yeah, and so, and like they still they're still alive. And when they saw me, it was a big mind blow to my wife because she was like, I thought they were Chinese. Like, honey, they are Chinese.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, and even like whenever she met my father's side of the family, my grandmother who speaks with a Caribbean accent, she was like, I thought you were Indian. I'm like, yeah, but we're Guyanese, so it's a kind of
Yeah.
thing. But can you explain your reasoning for why you included that quote so early on in your book?
I think because I often get people often use, well, uncles and aunties particularly have used my ability to speak Punjabi to shame their family, the younger
Hmm.
family. And I find that infuriating because the reason I can speak Punjabi is because I was never shamed. I was never overly corrected. It was just something, it was how I spoke in order to experience, connect with my BG, with my Punjabi grandmother. Um, and it's just to experience and feel her love, and that was what it was about. It was about just communicating, feeling connection, and like I say, yeah, there was never this expectation put on me, and I think largely that was also because of my whiteness, because there was not. I think if I was a little brown boy, they would have been like, oh well, obviously you should be able to speak Punjabi, but because I was this little white boy, it was like any effort I made was like really given a lot of praise, really like lots of positive reinforcement. And that's partly the point I make in the book is that wouldn't it be wonderful if all of our experiences were that? I think we would all acquire those languages much more easily. And I just really wanted to make that point because I think I'm sometimes credited with I'm given more credit than I'm due because I can speak the language. Like I say, it wasn't my achievement. It was my parents made a
Yeah.
very conscious effort to immerse me in the language. Yeah, I was living with my Punjabi grandparents. I spent time in India, and I say this also. It's not really a reader's fault. Is that it's also that there's a lack of resources. I think the reason we think like this, that is, oh, I didn't learn it as a kid, and therefore it's a lost cause. you know, if we if the same resources existed for learning Punjabi or Urdu or Hindi or Marathi or Tamil or Malayalam or whatever, if it was as easy to learn those languages as it is easy to learn, I don't know, Spanish or French or even, Chinese, Mandarin, like I don't think we'd be having these conversations. There is a lack of resources. And so I think I really just wanted to highlight that and be like, it is possible. Obviously, there's work to be done on the resources front, but it's not impossible. These languages aren't preternaturally difficult. They are beautiful languages, and particularly, when we talk about like history and research, I read a lot of William Dalrymple's work as part of my reading for this book. There's huge amount. I've spoken to him on quite a few occasions. There's huge volumes of material, like first, like original texts, like primary sources that are untouched because they are in languages that are not widely read and spoken now. So
Yeah. And
yeah,
in Houston, a lot of people could resonate with that because there was a history in Texas, especially where people that grew up of Mexican ancestry were not allowed to speak Spanish in school. And because of that mindset, because of these unfortunate circumstances, young children were not taught Spanish, and that's what my parents never taught me, that kind of thing. My wife learned Spanish when she was in college, but she also kind of learned in high school because that was the way she could communicate with her grandparents. And I learned Spanish while I was in university. Um, and so just being able to make that connection of, well, and also I want to bring something up for our audience. Uncles and aunties are not biologically our uncles and aunties.
yeah.
They're random strangers that for some reason, because they're older than us, feel the need to tell us, hey, Jassa, you got fat since the last time I saw you. And you're like, thanks. So,
Yeah,
like, they just feel very comfortable in criticizing, and to them, it's I'm just being helpful. But they don't recognize that there's a consequence
mm,
to their words.
yeah, yeah,
And so this is nice that you're like, it's never too late. And I loved this other quote. You said, "White guests approached me seeking fellow fish out of water, but uncles were amazed to see me proficiently eating with my hands and discovering that you spoke Punjabi and used that to accost and shame the kids." And it's like that's so unfortunate because like they look at me and like, "Oh, you could speak Spanish. How come you don't speak Spanish?" Like, hey,
Right,
hey, I learned it in college and I'm not even that good at the language.
right, yeah. Yeah. I
Um,
think it's like I don't know why people don't realize it's their responsibility. It's not like you can just grow a language out of it. The child's not just born with a language. Like it has to be a language has to be taught. Like
because it's easier to criticize, it's easy to condemn, but hard to create.
yeah, I guess. Yeah, yeah.
So let's get back to the book. What's life been like now that you've been able to let writing has always been cathartic for me.
Mm.
And you, I guess, in the entertainment industry as a writer as well, what's life been like now that you've been able to sort of let everything that you've been holding on to on paper now?
It was incredibly cathartic. I didn't when I wrote the last line of the book, I didn't realize I was writing the last line of the book. The end of the book just sort of happened, and it sort of
Yeah.
found that. I mean, I don't, no spoilers, but there's a sort of a very neat and obvious conclusion that it reaches, and it caught me so off guard. As soon as I sort of wrote it without thinking it, then just burst into tears and was like, "Oh wow, I felt this. I've done it. That's it." And that I I think what the joy now is that I get to live the person that I became through the process of this. I feel like I know who I am now. I have a, there's so much more to experience and discover, but I'm doing that from a place of such grounded self-knowledge. And I find, even with my acting now, that whenever I'm reading scripts or preparing roles, it's always it's not about me anymore. Like I'm not trying to use the script or the role in order to find something. uh, it's I'm allowing the character, what does the character need, what does the script need, what's on the page, figuring that stuff out, and I can draw on stuff that's in my own life now in a much more healthy, conscious way, whereas before I would have experiences where something would maybe resonate and I'd be like, that speaks to that part of me, and it would almost be like these like micro acts of re-traumatizing myself, because that was like I would relive those emotions in the performance of it, and then I'd find it very difficult to come back out of it, or I'd find it difficult to recreate it readily on like multiple takes. Whereas now I feel much more in command of I guess my tools as an actor, but more than anything, yeah, just the joy of being able to, yeah, live as my full and whole self now, feeling like I found some kind of answer which really puts that question of who am I? Um, I was going to say to rest, but it's not. It's that's an ongoing question. But at least I feel like I'm now fully engaged with it, and I'm answering the question on my terms now. I think
Yeah.
that's really the heart of it. I'm no longer looking externally to be like, am I over there? Am I over there? I always thought belonging was something to be found out there. I now realize it is something that we do and create for ourselves.
That's why we're always lost.
But we need
Yeah,
to.
yeah. Um, Speaking of resonating with characters, what are you hoping that readers will resonate with whenever they read this book?
I think the most beautiful thing that I found, I think we touched on it a bit earlier, is people are reading it thinking they're reading about my experience, and then they discover that they're actually having their own experience. And I think I very consciously wrote this book to be very specific about this is my journey. Come on me with on my journey. And I don't really, there are a couple of moments where I challenge the reader directly, but I don't really, this isn't like a guidebook or a hand or like a do the, and there's no like exercises at the end. It's very much like it's a story, and I wrote it. I tried writing a non-fiction book, and I really struggled. And I was like, well, I know story, I know character arc, I know all those things as an actor and filmmaker and storyteller, and so I restructured the whole way in which I wrote the book as this story. And what I hope is that firstly people enjoy the story, and then hopefully that they perhaps see aspects of themselves in that story, as I think all that's what all good stories do. And if it inspires in some way a reader to reflect on their own sense of self and maybe ask some questions and perhaps go on their own adventure, I think that's all I can really hope for.
Was
Um,
there anything else you want to add before we conclude this recording?
I don't think so. No, I just think maybe the only thing I would say that often that this often those of us who feel like we have to figure out this question of our identity of who am I, it can often feel like something quite negative or painful.
Mhm.
Um, and I would suggest that this is actually it is a joyous invitation. How wonderful that at such an early point in our lives we are prompted to reflect on that question, who am I?
Yeah.
And think about like how many people sadly get to the end of their lives and only just then in those final moments then start to think about that question. And I think I feel so grateful that because I didn't necessarily fit within a specific box, I've been able to confront that question and find a peace and joy within it. Um, and I think that's available to all of us if we're prepared to take that dive.
What else is available to all of us is this book, Both Not Half. You like that?
It's such a beautiful like I was trying not to like reference it, but I was like it's like so good.
I can do it. I can do it. Let me be the guy.
What a
We always
pro.
have to end on a happy note. This book, Both Not Half. I don't have the physical copy. I had the PDF version, but I'm hoping that you're going to send me a signed copy very soon.
We will sort that out for sure. Yeah, here it is.
Yeah, Both Not Half by Jassa Ahluwalia, available now in the US as well as the UK. Will make for a great Christmas present or whatever holiday you celebrate. Jessa, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. We appreciate your time.
Ahmed, thank you so much. This has been a real joy.